Welcome to the Eating at a Meeting podcast. I'm your host, Tracy Stuckrath, dietary needs expert, certified meetings manager, certified food protection manager. I have searched the globe to find people and businesses who are creating safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experiences for their employees, guests, and communities. In each episode, you will find authentic conversations about how food and beverage impacts inclusion, sustainability, culture, community, health, and wellness. I know that sounds like a lot, but we're going to cover it all. Are you ready to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line? If so, let's go. Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Eating at a Meeting. It's Tracy Stuckrath, and I am back in my office, and I'm so excited to be in North Carolina. It is a bit chilly today, so I have my pink sweater on, but I'm excited to bring to you my guest to the right here, wherever on however point, Jill Blood. She is the Vice President and Deputy General Counsel for Martiz. And in addition to doing her legal work, Jill is also responsible for Martiz's compliance and privacy efforts. Everybody, I actually got introduced to Jill through Andrea at Skift magazine because she was writing an article based on what she heard you talking about at IMAX. And Andrea reached out to me to get a quote on what you need to know about health data, privacy laws, and events, how they mix and match. So Jill, tell us, what does Vice President and Deputy General Counsel of Martiz mean, and as well as the compliance and privacy? What do you have to do with that in meetings industry?
Sure, great. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here. I loved seeing your quote in that article because it was such a great perspective, and thrilled to be having this conversation. So my role, I'm a part of our legal team. So really anything and everything legal that crosses the desk of Martiz comes my way. So as you can imagine, a lot of contracting, hotel contracts, DNC contracts, templates for those, but also things like navigating privacy, health regulations, navigating force majeure a lot in the last few years.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
So really anything and everything. I think one of the fun parts about being in this industry is that you truly never know what's going to cross your desk in a given day. So some days it's health compliance laws, and some days it's what level of insurance do we need to rent a blimp today? And you just never know when you open your email in the morning.
Well, and and I don't think people who aren't in the industry don't understand all of the intricacies, legal and insurance-wise, that we have to take into consideration as planners. Yeah.
And I frankly was surprised when I came in. I started my career doing mergers and acquisitions work at a big firm, and then went to sort of a chemical company for a while that made amino acids that go into livestock feed. Very different industry than where we are now. I remember thinking planning meeting and events, sort of how hard could it be? You show up and the meeting goes well. Because I think like a lot of professions in this industry, if it happens well, you don't really see the little the chicken floating on the water treading, and then got into it and realized how complicated it is to get that many suppliers and vendors and people moving activities, and people fall down and they eat something that doesn't agree to them, and they sort of just make choices on events, and you're just navigating this web of compliance when you just have people in a space together. There's a bunch of legal and liability issues to navigate, which is fun, but I'm never bored.
Well, that's good. And I think meeting planning allows you not to be bored, for sure.
Absolutely. It's also made me a meeting snob. I feel like I used to go to meetings and just not even notice. And now I'm at sort of legal industry meetings I feel like this is not, I would have set up the bar differently.
Oh, that's so funny. Yeah, it does. Once you got that eye for it, it does change a lot of things.
You see it.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so in this Skift article, let's just jump right into this. In this Skift article, the title was, and I'm going to put the link in here for everybody too, New Health Data Privacy Laws May Impact Your Meetings. And in that was the My Health, My Data out of the state of Washington. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Washington recently enacted a new law. It sort of is in line with privacy laws that have been happening. GDPR passed in Europe, California passed a law, other states did. Washington's been sort of eyeing a similar privacy law, but they took a different approach than some states where it's really focused on health data privacy. So instead of consumer privacy, it's really focused on health information. And I think at a 10,000 foot view level, that's great. People should have control over how that health information is collected and shared and used, be able to know when that's happening, control who it gets shared with, and change their minds. You share your health information with a health tracking app, and then you say, I want to delete my account. You should be able to stop that. What's interesting about Washington is they defined health data pretty broadly, much more broadly than we've seen. So it includes your medical records, your medical history, but it also includes things like measurements. So for merits, we sometimes have events where people go on a helicopter and you need height and weight. Mm-hmm. That's something that I think meeting planners wouldn't necessarily think of as health data in the same way of sort of a diagnosis. But it also includes things like dietary preferences, when those preferences are tied to a medical issue. So if I say, I just don't like eating shellfish, that's not covered by the law. If I say I'm allergic to shellfish, or I have these other restrictions that might keep me from eating those foods, that would be covered. So I think it's just a new way of thinking about that data.
Okay.
Protected data.
Right. Well, and I think I brought it up in the article. Years ago, I was doing a speech for a presentation for Freeman. And one of the dietary needs got submitted, and the attorney for Freeman noted the kosher requests. And he jumped on that saying, please be cautious of how you manage that data because of what's going on in our world right now, that somebody could actually be targeted for that information. And I know that doesn't fall under the health data, but it's the same kind of information that we need to protect.
I think that's absolutely right. And this is something we talk about a lot internally and with our clients is there are a lot of areas where these laws sort of feel burdensome. There's also a lot of places where a good guest experience kind of aligns with complying with these laws. You don't necessarily want to publicize why somebody has a special meal. I know we were recently at dinner. My mom just she's a picky eater. She doesn't like eating shellfish. And somebody sort of yelled, like, does anybody not want shrimp? And she was like, I don't really want to yell across a hibachi restaurant that I have a dietary preference. I would sort of rather that have been on a card that I could have done more subtly. Mm-hmm. We see that. And you're right. There's a lot of reasons that somebody might not want somebody to know, I don't eat this food. I have a health restriction. I have a religious sort of need that's there. So a lot of what these laws require is sort of thoughtfully collecting that information, sharing it thoughtfully, and getting consent when you share it and how you share it. So maybe instead of a card that says gluten allergy, you have a picture of wheat with a line through it that doesn't really reveal why that person might have a special need.
Okay. That's interesting and I'll find my cards because I have designed cards too that helps people identify themselves, and actually had that issue a couple of weeks ago with people put in their information, but then they were not told how do they communicate their needs with the service staff.
That's interesting.
And they were frustrated because they couldn't get what they needed. And it makes it harder, to me, it makes it hard on the staff as well as the attendees. But how do you give that information is correct? Yeah.
And I think that's a challenge with this law because I think it's very well intentioned. I think it's going to offer a lot of protection to a lot of people, but it's fundamentally not designed for the meeting and events industry. It's really designed for people handling health records and more. Right. My company has information about my health. How is that shared? I'm sharing health information with a doctor, with a care provider. I suspect the drafters weren't thinking about people attending a conference. And in some cases, that information needs to be shared and needs to be public. And people don't always make decisions that are in their own best interest. So I think the concern we've been trying to navigate is one of the requirements of the law is that you say, do you approve us collecting this information and do you approve us sharing it with these people? Mm-hmm. Theoretically, somebody could say, well, no, I don't want it shared. But that same person needs that information shared on site and will come to the event and want that shared. So we're working on language that would sort of, if you say no, would pop up and kind of explain, hey, by clicking no on this is what it means, or offer more details on, we are sharing this information with these people for these reasons. We're not blasting it out on social media. We're saying we need to use this information for this limited purpose, and that's all we'll share.
And I think that's something that we as planners have not really done a good job of in the first place. I mean, we ask the questions, and even with the open-ended questions of like, oh, what's your dietary need? And then it's left for a lot of interpretation.
And I teach using checkboxes, right? Hey, check here if you have a meat allergy or shellfish allergy or whatever. But then definitely saying this is how it's going to be used and how we're going to use the data.
And I think that's the perfect example of what you're describing of sort of proactive consent and information about how it's shared. It's pretty in line with sort of the tenets of this law. There's some formality around it, but it also seems like a great experience for that individual to say, I didn't just check a box and forget about it. I had information on, well, we will share that with the caterer. We will share that with how this is how that will be used. And you have some visibility into that sharing and also some control over if somebody said, for whatever reason, I don't want that shared with the caterer. You could take that back and then explain to them, well, that means that at the lunch event on day 2, there might not be a meal ready for you.
Right. Exactly. Well, and I think that's the really important part. And so many people who have dietary needs, like you mentioned, your mom, are hesitant to give the information. One, because they don't want to be a burden, but 2, they've gotten burned, quote unquote, or sick. And so they want to navigate it on their own. But at the same time, we can't provide a safe environment if we don't know.
And I think I'm glad that's becoming sort of more, I think, socially acceptable to talk about these types of needs. But I remember when I was graduating from law school and they sent us all to interview training, and you would have a lunch where you sat down and they said, eat whatever's put in front of you. Like, you don't want to look difficult and request something else. And I remember people sort of raising that of, well, I can't eat everything, or I don't want to eat everything. And they were like, oh, well, you don't want to seem like you're hard to work with or you're difficult. And that was not that long ago, but I think the world has already changed to that idea of that's not difficult to have a dietary restriction. It's a dietary restriction, and that should be accommodated and can be easily. But I think we still have a little bit of work to do to get that to where it's not. But I think one of the steps is not making somebody at a table of 10 sort of raise their hands and say, I have a shellfish allergy, and then everybody turns and looks at you. And for some people that's comfortable, and for some people it's not. And I think we cases where that feels more comfortable.
Now, I'm going to be curious because it makes me think of women who are pregnant and they haven't told their companies yet. So how that would be somebody who really doesn't want to spill the beans. They haven't done their gender reveal thing or anything like that. That would be would that be protected under this information too?
It would be, yeah. That would be considered sort of health information, as would really any sort of piece of information about your health. So if you had COVID, if you have COVID, if you're diabetic, if you're pregnant, anything like that. And again, I think that's where there's a challenge, because having that information could help an event planner to say, well, you're probably not going to want to go whitewater rafting or skydiving. But so I think it's the same idea of collecting that information, being transparent about saying, we are collecting it. Do you consent to that? And then we will have to share it with these people. Do you consent to that? So we're not just taking it ourselves. We're also sharing it. So it'll bleed through to things like ADA accommodations as well, where if you need a wheelchair to meet you at the airport, that could indicate an underlying health situation. So we want to be clear about downstream who's that being shared with, how are we using it, and making sure people feel comfortable about that.
So many stories are popping up into my head to align with all of those things. And I think planners can actually probably do the same thing in their head of like, oh, well, maybe I should have given that. But I also think there's a lot with that means that we have to be a lot more transparent, even though we may want to keep that hot air balloon ride secret as a surprise. We also need to, as planners, be looking at the reports that are generated from the registration to catch those red flags, potential red flags.
And be ready for it. I think that's exactly right. You use the word transparency. I think that's critical for these laws and for privacy laws in general. We talk a lot internally about avoiding what I like to call the creepy factor, where you're like, you can use people's data. And if I show up at a meeting and because I said Diet Coke's my favorite drink, there's a Diet Coke in my room, that's great. If I show up and there's a framed picture of my dog because somebody did a deep dive on Facebook and found a picture of my dog, that's maybe not a good experience for somebody. And so I think that idea of, are you using the data in an anticipated way that when I provided, I love Diet Coke, it's not out of the realm of possibilities there would be a Diet Coke waiting for me. So I think using that data in a way that's transparent, is anticipated, and that makes sense to the guest. I think you can do fun, surprise, creative design things, but you want to do that in a way that maybe doesn't take advantage of the private information. I know I heard a story about somebody, like online ads have gotten so good that somebody was getting pregnancy ads before they realized they were pregnant because their buying purchasers had done it. And they said, well, I didn't know, but also my partner didn't know. And this created some sort of challenges in my life. Please don't do that. And then people are saying, well, we have to step that back a little bit because we don't want people finding out about health diagnoses because we figured it out from their search function.
Oh my goodness. Wow.
Can you imagine just for diapers and being like, that's weird. And then 3 weeks later, looking back like, oh, okay. And I think AI is going to amp that up too, where these tools have gotten so powerful. There's so much good. We also want to be thoughtful about how we're using them and what the guest experience is like at the other end.
Okay, so all right, there's so many questions I have for you. I know Washington State has enacted this. Is it Massachusetts and Nevada as well?
Nevada. I suspect others will follow. It feels like when these laws happen, sort of everybody takes them on. The reason that Washington's a little bit different, in addition to being first, it's what keeps me up at night about Washington is it includes a private right of action. So in Nevada and in Connecticut, for a lot of these privacy laws, you would need sort of a government regulator or something like a class action for it to be enforced. For the Washington law, it's closer to ADA, where an individual can come and bring a suit and enforce it. And there's penalties, I think, ranging from sort of $5,000 to $20,000. I think those numbers aren't exactly right, but in that range where a company could do it. What we've seen a little bit with ADA is there are some folks who legitimately are disenfranchised and they're bringing those suits. There's also some activists who go to sites to test those things, law firms doing it for a payday. I think we might see something similar with Washington law where people could go to a site that collects this information and test it out just to bring that claim. So the risk is a little bit higher. Meetings are often not on regulators' radars, but they might be in Washington. But then Nevada, once you get all of the Vegas meetings in scope, pretty quickly, I think we're going to see people applying these protections just to every event.
Mike Lynn just commented that you and I are right on target. Woohoo! And it's mind-boggling because planners already have a lot of information that we collect. And I don't think people understand all of the legal, like we said at the very beginning, that we have to pay attention to. So my question on that too, is this similar? Well, I don't, Tyra and I talk about this, Tyra Warner talking about this. In the UK, there's a law. It's it's about dying. If they get hurt, if they're a resident of the UK and they travel for work, say to Las Vegas or wherever, the United States, and they get hurt on the job, because they're traveling for work, corporate homicide and act, something like that. And the company is liable for it. But then again, if I'm traveling for work from the US and I go to the UK and I get hurt, the same thing, my company's liable for that. It's a lot more deep than that. And you're the lawyer, so I'm not going to go there. But so my point in bringing that up is that mean that a Washington resident attending an event in the state of Florida can enact that? Or does it have to be an event that's held in the state of Washington?
Yeah, so it's similar to GDPR, where GDPR's privacy protections apply to sort of EU residents wherever they are. Washington's similar. So it would apply to Washington residents, but also to information collected in Washington or sort of used in Washington. So we're looking at that as being people who have addresses in Washington, sort of residents of Washington. Technically, I think it would apply to wherever you are when you complete your registration, but asking a question of where are you right now seems like it's a little worse on a privacy standpoint.
Right.
So we're viewing it as Washington residents and also meetings that happen in Washington. Same thing's true for Connecticut and Vegas. What we see on these privacy laws is that a lot of clients take the stance of applying it to everyone. It doesn't always feel right to say, if you have a dietary restriction in Washington, you get sort of special control and disclosure than you would if you were in Oregon. So what we're anticipating, what a lot of our sort of clients who are initially thinking about are saying is we will probably treat this nationwide, especially when you bring any event that happens in Vegas into the mix. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of numbers.
Right.
And it's just hard to keep track of these state by state as they go online.
Right.
So I think we'll see a lot of people applying it across the US, but if you have an event that's everybody's in one state, it's more of a local event, maybe you don't need to worry about it, but it's probably safer to just apply it. And like we talked about, in a lot of cases, it can be a good guest experience, I think, if you frame it well.
Yeah. And I think that goes along with ADP or the ADA and like ensuring that you're not making an accommodation just for Jill to be able to get to the beach party, right? You're building her something like design it inclusive, design it like so it's holistically thought of for everyone to participate that way.
And you're going to capture a lot of people who maybe don't. I'm sort of a particular eater. I don't love eating meat. I'm just not a meat eater. So while I don't have a restriction or an allergy, I'm not a vegetarian. I love it when I see tofu options because that's just a preferred food of mine. So that inclusiveness can capture a lot more people. I think that's true for ADA accommodations too, that having different ways to sort of consume content, having subtitles on in case somebody's on a plane and forgets their headphones, you capture them. You also capture people who have hearing loss. And I think that a lot of times if you do them right, and I know our teams are so good at creative solutions to say, well, we need to have this option. How do we build it in? That's not, well, you're going to be over there doing something different that feels different.
Right. Exactly. Okay. So not giving legal advice per se, how do you suggest planners actually this information?
So I think this law is complex enough that my first recommendation would be to reach out to an expert. We work with a firm out of Colorado called KO who's given us great advice. Also, we're the ones who put this on our radar. He said, send it to me. And I said, well, we don't handle health data. And then I got a follow-up email that said, I think you do. Take a closer look. And we're very grateful to have those folks looking out for us. But so I think talking to your experts, talking to whoever you work with to handle sort of your private information, I think the advice we give a lot is only collect the data that you need. Sometimes you just need to know, I don't eat meat. You don't need to know, is that a religious thing? Is it a health thing? What is it? So being thoughtful about the data you collect, and are you collecting data that you absolutely need, or is it you're collecting superfluous information that maybe you don't? We talk about that a lot in terms of aggregated data. Do you need to know that Jill doesn't eat meat, or do you need to know that there are 10 vegetarians and there's options on the buffet? So I think being really thoughtful about obtaining consent, who you're sharing it with, that you're being really thoughtful about only collecting and sharing information when you need to. So if the caterer needs to know it, they have it. The transportation company probably doesn't need to know people's information. So being thoughtful about how you share it. And I think transparency is really key. The law has some requirements around collecting consent, but I think that transparency of sort of what data is being collected, how it's being shared, how it's being used goes a long way towards helping you be compliant.
And I think
you mentioned these things as they continue to evolve.
Right. Yeah. And I think you said something earlier too is about having templates. And I think making sure that you're putting that template in. And I think that it's a template that you should put into your RFP saying, hey, this is what we're wanting to do. And because my next question is, what do we need to do with our catering partners, our hotels, convention centers, the people we're giving this information to, the helicopter company, right? What do we need to make sure that they're doing to help protect the information? And it kind of goes back to that GDPR and other data protection laws.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, that there's sort of flow down requirements that you're complying with the law, but that you're also making sure you sort of have a responsible supplier network. So for us, part of that is choosing suppliers that we know and trust, handle this information well, putting contractual protections in place, having things like privacy policies that address this, but really that's handled at a contractual level to say, you're getting this information, you'll only keep it as long as you need it, you'll get rid of it, and you're not going to sell it or share it out past that. But I think, having strong contracts and strong sort of registration, information collecting templates, but then just knowing who you're working with and knowing that you have that supplier network, I think is really critical, that you know that they sort of will do right by your attendees in the same way that you would.
And that's the word relationship is very important there. It's not just picking somebody willy-nilly to do this event because, they have a helicopter. It's not necessarily that. You want to make sure that they've got the gumption behind them, right? The truth behind them. Yeah.
And I think reading through those parts of the contracts, I know it seems like the industry's more risk adverse than ever. I think a lot of people got burned during the pandemic. They saw cancellations. Contracts are harder and more complicated. And we've seen not a full trend, but occasionally contracts come through where somebody says, well, we're not responsible for complying with dietary restrictions. We're like, but we need you. This is important. And what they're trying to do is just push off that liability to say, if somebody has a reaction, we're not liable. And we always push back and say, we're not trying to push liability, but we do want you to be motivated to do this because it's critically important to us, to these attendees.
Right.
We want that to be a shared risk where we all sort of have skin in the game to make sure that that's happening and it's happening well.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Because it is. I mean, and I gave an example last week when I was speaking in Canada. I'm like, if one of your clients is hosting a fundraiser for their foundation, right? And that person is paying $5,000 for a table or whatever, and they have a shellfish allergy and you put shellfish in front of them or they have a reaction, and they've told you that they have a shellfish allergy, do you think they're going to give you the $5,000 next year? I mean,
and that's even assuming that they don't, shellfish they can see and not hidden in something that they wouldn't have known about.
Right. Exactly.
I think I have a friend who doesn't eat pork for religious reasons. And she said the number of times she's ordered a dish you would have no thought would have pork and it comes out with bacon. And she's like, why is there secret bacon and everything? Why did you not tell me that? I would have made a different choice.
Right.
People who have reactions, there can be real liability there, but there needs to be, I think, accountability throughout the whole chain.
Right.
Making sure that this is being done well.
Yeah. Well, and that comes, and to me, I've been talking about ADA and food allergies for 13 years now, and it does fall under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And depending on where you host it, if it's a government-owned facility, you have another level of ADA to think about as well.
People don't always think about ADA and food allergies.
But it was deemed that, yeah. So,
which, of course it is. Of course it should be.
Right.
But I think people think of wheelchairs exclusively when ADA, and it's so much broader. We talk about that then with sort of web accessibility, things like that is broader in scope than people immediately think it is.
Right. Exactly. All right. Mike has a couple of comments here, and one of the things he says, he does love seeing more vegetarian and vegan options. I still want them to be improved. To me, they're still lacking in a lot of variety of ways, Mike. Sorry, that was Allie. Sorry, Allie.
And when you
I agree.
It's amazing.
Oh, yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Just sort of a vegetable pasta when it's people who really take the time. Unbelievable.
Yes. All right. So this is going back a little bit to our green conference. I just blocked both of our faces. I'm going to take it down really quickly. But he's talking about the initiatives and maybe actually how do we make sure that they're doing these, and is there a penalty? It was kind of that recycling thing that he was saying the housekeeper was putting both bins, the trash from both bins into the same trash can in her cart, right? And they said, hey, well, it all goes onto the same place. But as a planner, that's a really important question to ask, because I know that Mandalay Bay, for example, they sort behind the scenes. They have people that are in the back sorting for the trash and putting it in the right spots because they don't want us to have to think about it. So they've actually hired the people to do it. But that's something to think about in the questions that you ask in your RFP and in your planning process of how do you handle sustainability practices, food waste, et cetera. So Mike, really good point. And thank you for bringing that up because it really does. And it's okay that it's off topic. But
you and I were talking about this in sort of our pre-meeting of, I do think that type of stuff we're seeing show up more and more in contracts. That for a while, it was a little more kind of warm and fuzzy. You'll do your best to support a green meeting. And we're just in the last really 6 months starting to see requirements and metrics and penalties and really people putting a little more teeth into those provisions. If I had my crystal ball out, I suspect that trend will continue on both of these fronts. Things like dietary restrictions and health data, and also things like sustainability and green initiatives.
Yeah.
But they'll start to feel a little more meaty.
Okay, so kind of I don't want to annoy any of my hoteliers out there, but how do we as planners, I mean, And you just said, it's like, how do we do this? Because there's lots of penalties out there on our side that we get hit with, but there's not a lot of penalties that we put on the hotel if they don't do this. So is there anything around this, my health, my data things that we can say, hey, if that information is used in an incongruent way, that we can penalize you for that? Or is that not something to do yet?
I think it's early, so the law doesn't even go into effect until March. I think there's going to be a learning curve as people start to navigate it. We've seen our hotel partners be really good about privacy. I mean, they're in the business of welcoming people. If people don't feel safe staying somewhere, they're going to make a different choice. So our hotel partners across the board seem to be very privacy conscious, really respectful of that. Of course, there's exceptions, but on the whole, I think they're there. What we tend to encourage is having those conversations early and often and saying, we have a population that has these needs. How can you accommodate them? How can we work together? The hotel wants it to be a great food and beverage experience. Nobody wants people sort of leaving unsatisfied, but having those conversations early and often and really talking about what's important. Is it having a few meals set aside? Is it having a bunch of options, just sort of partnering with them? And we've seen hotels do some really creative and cool stuff to navigate this. I think it requires that partnership and sort of creative design and flagging it early, that it's not the day before and you're like, now how can we accommodate these dietary preferences? It's part of the planning it goes in. I think the same thing's true for sustainability. It's not sort of a lob on. It's something that should live throughout sort of life cycle of the planning process.
I like the term early and often, because it needs to not be talked about once and then forgotten and then the day before. Yeah. So often to reiterate, because you also are passed on from the salesperson, then to the convention services manager. And then depending on, is it the banquet captain? Is it the server, the bartender? They need to understand that information as well. So how does that data or that information get passed on all the way through?
And I think that's something our design teams are really good about, coming to me, and they'll come to me with 15 different options. They're like, can we do this? And I'm like, well, this, like really thinking about, well, if here are the walls that we need to sort of comply with from a compliance standpoint, how can we make that happen? Can the cookie pop-up be like pithy and kind of fun, or does it need to be legalese? Like, I think there's ways to do this compliance that feels organic and warm and not you're signing a 50-page waiver. And I think that kind of creativity of sitting down and working through what are needs to have, what are nice to have, where do we have a little bit of flexibility. We've seen clients and some of our designers come up with some really elegant solutions that feel organic, but are actually sort of really serving a meaningful compliance function.
And so compliance, compliance and ethics, what does that mean? I mean, and I know that we've done that, but compliance is complying with the law. Yeah. Is that basically what it is?
Laws and regulations. So you see it a lot in terms of sort of working with governments, different restrictions there, but also privacy laws, these types of laws, really any sort of, you're complying with laws, you're with regulations, compliance with ADA obligations, things like that. So I think a lot of people think it's boring. I think it's fun. That's part of why I have the job that I have. But I think there are a lot of compliance things that feel like red tape and checking the box, but then we try and boil it down to more of the spirit of the law, something like Washington saying people should have control over their health data. I think it can help you think through, instead of, well, we need to do these things and have these words, how do we sort of live into both the letter and the spirit of those laws is a lot of what we spend our time thinking about.
Well, and I think it comes down to when you're on that registration form, saying, please let us know, how can we accommodate you, or what disabilities you have? It's not asking that. It's like saying, hey, we want everyone to fully participate in this event. How can we support you in fully participating? And ask these questions or answer these questions for us, right?
Absolutely. The example I use a lot is on CAN-SPAM compliance. So you have the ability to opt out of emails. Some companies, you say, I want to opt out, and they say, okay, we'll never email you again. And there's some companies where it pops something up that says, hey, is it that you never want to hear from us, or do you just want to hear from us once a month or only when we have a big sale? And almost always I'll click, yeah, email me when you have a huge sale. I just don't want to get an email advertising a new sweater every single day because it starts to feel like noise. And I think sometimes people say, well, they need the ability to opt out, but you can ask those questions and sort of try and get to, okay, well, what is it that you're really looking for? What is it that you're comfortable sharing? It can be a little bit more of a dialogue, a little bit, I think, warmer than just click this box.
Right. And I like that analogy because I just did it this morning too. I don't want to hear from you 5 times a day. But it's like, okay, so because in some of the ways I ask it is like, how can we help you fully participate? Do you have mobility, vision, hearing, food out, dietary needs, right? How does that work? And then ask some follow-up questions and saying, hey, we're asking these questions because we're feeding you, right? And we want to make sure that you don't die, right? Yeah.
There will be lunch on day 2, so you need to know. Or to your point, even if it's a surprise activity, to say there will be a surprise activity that may involve walking more than a mile, may involve these things. Like, let us know if you're not comfortable with that. I think but you just don't want to put somebody in a position of showing up somewhere and saying, well, I can't do this or I can't eat this. And you never ask me the question.
Well, and I actually have that example. When I was a in-house corporate planner, we did a whole scavenger hunt through Epcot. And after the event, when everybody was going home, one of the gentlemen, and this is in-house corporate event, he's like, Tracy, I really wish you had told us that we were going to be walking up to 5 miles today because I would have changed my pain management distribution. He's a former Redskins or Commanders football player. And he would have changed how the medicine would have been dispersed through the day if he had known that. And this is 15 years ago, so I wasn't even thinking about that. But I'm like, that story now pops into my head quite regularly because that information is important to share.
And I can see where you'd be planning and say, this is going to be a fun surprise. People are going to love it. You wouldn't necessarily think to ask that version of that question.
Right. Exactly.
And I think for a compliance standpoint, it's good to collect that information and be thoughtful about it. But I think also it's a good experience. And then I think what these new laws would require is you to say, we're collecting it for this reason, and here's who we're sharing it with.
Right.
That probably isn't kind of upfront disclosures. You'd say, well, we are going to share it with these. And then people would have the ability to request sort of later on who all got my information and to say, I'd like you to delete it now.
Right. Exactly. Okay. So put in here early and often is very accurate, starting with the RFP site visit planning. Yes, I love that it's a continuous process. You're right, Chaz. Thank you for posting.
Totally agree. Yeah. Counterintuitively, I feel like the advice I give a lot of our team members is it's not a legal issue at first. It's a business issue. How do these conversations, sometimes people are too quick to say, well, we want contractual language and penalties, and that'll come. And I think that is important that you have these requirements. But it's a paragraph in the contract, but it's also a discussion to have throughout the life cycle to say, how do we make this work? How do we operationalize this in a way that feels right and feels true to our organization?
Right. One of the questions that you and I had talked about previously was, and I've probably seen and I've heard planners say, well, our legal is like, well, we're not going to accommodate any kind of dietary restrictions at our events. And so we're not going to, or we're just going to let it go. They have to figure it out on their own. And so planners stop asking those questions. So do you recommend that planners stop asking these questions about people's information, or do it the way you just said, is asking in a very thoughtful way?
So that's a question we get a lot about privacy laws in general of, so should we just stop using data? And definitely not. This is there to sort of control it and give guidelines. So like I said, if we sort of evangelize, collect only the data you need, use it in ways that are anticipated, get consent, and then only keep it as long as you need. So you're being thoughtful. We've found that a lot of the data we use is almost as valuable, anonymized and aggregated as it is on an individual basis. So do you need to know that Jill Blood in this sort of from this address came to this meeting? Or do you need to know a woman in this age band who does this type of work came to the meeting and had these experiences? So when we aggregate it, it's a lot safer to use that data. And almost all of the use cases that we needed, we don't need people's social security numbers to know what sort of trends we're seeing on activities in people's life or things like that. So I think that sort of anonymizing and aggregating and just being really thoughtful and putting yourselves in the seat of an attendee and saying, well, would this feel right that my data is being used in this way? Does this feel anticipated? When I registered, of course, I knew I'd have a name badge. Did I know that you put my face up on a Jumbotron? Maybe not. And so thinking about anticipated use cases and getting sort of granular consent for them.
Right. And it makes me think of a post that I did yesterday about the event in Canada that I went to. And I went through everybody's dietary needs and I'm sorting it. And I think it's really important to know specifics if somebody's like going to die from eating a peanut, right? And so that we know that that information is there. But when I'm sending the information to the caterer, I can say, hey, I've got 25 vegetarians. I've got 3 people allergic to peanuts. So it's that aggregated data with nobody's name associated to it. But then when it comes down to the actual implementation, I know not to give Jill that plate with peanuts on it.
I think that's exactly aggregated, safer. And I also think you don't always need to disclose the underlying medical condition. You could say this person, I think you can indicate severity without necessarily saying this person has this disease, or to your point earlier, it's a religious issue. Right. All they need to know is this person should not have pork products, not necessarily, and here's why. The why isn't always important. I think severity is very important. There's a big difference between sort of a preference and a severe allergy. But I think you don't necessarily always need to sort of disclose the underlying health conditions so much as sort of what that means. And I think that can be a little bit safer under these laws as well.
Well, that just reminds me of all the restaurants that are like, well, do you have celiac disease? You don't eat gluten. So I'm like, that's none of your business.
It makes me cringe. It's not socially even where somebody will say, I'm not eating gluten. And immediately someone will say like, oh, why? Or they'll say that. And just the inner lawyer and compliance person in me is like, oh, don't, you have no idea what answer you're going to get back. Like, it could be that this person got lost in a wheat field as a child and has never been able to look at wheat again. Or it could be any number of things that probably are not good dinner conversation.
Right, exactly. Nobody wants to talk about their poop. I mean,
you wouldn't ask about any other medical condition in the same way. It's interesting.
Right.
And a million reasons why people may or may not be eating something.
Yes, exactly. All right. So let's see. What do you wish people knew about your job that you love so much, the compliance, and you love it? So is there anything that you wish that people really kind of understood about compliance, ethics, and the law as it relates to this or just in general?
I think that sometimes people are just scared of these things. It feels like Washington has a new law that's scary, and how easy it is to sort of break those things down to, it doesn't need to feel burdensome. It doesn't need to be a bad guest experience. It doesn't need to sort of hinder planning a great event. You can work within those confines to do almost anything you want to do it responsibly. And I think sometimes people get intimidated and they almost don't start the conversation with their, I don't want to get into liability waivers. I don't want to do this. And sometimes that looks like not doing an activity that maybe you could have done, or almost taking on more risk than you would need to because you're sort of nervous about the contractual side of it. So I think having those conversations, being thoughtful about how can we get around this. So I think these laws are broader than a lot of people think they are. Sort of privacy touches everything now. I think that's the trend we're going in. It's going to get worse before it gets better. So I think not being afraid to sort of think outside the box and be creative and ask those questions.
And I like how you phrased it earlier too. It's a business decision. It's a design decision first, and then let's get into what could be the implications if we don't think through some of these things.
And that's what I love about working with our team is they're challenging sometimes. They'll push, but I'll say, well, we can't do this exact thing. And they'll come back with, here's 5 more suggestions. Like, this is the end goal. We want people to have a really exciting Tuesday afternoon. We talked about going shark diving. That's not going to be the thing. But what if we did these other things? How can we make it safe? How can we do it? And I think in some cases, that has sparked almost a more creative, more engaging outcome than you otherwise would have had something else. I think it can be interesting to think about how do we create a vegetarian food option that's also just as dynamic and just as good. Sometimes that can sort of spark the creativity of great event designers. And I love seeing that when you say no or say that they need to rethink it. And instead of them just walking away, they're back the next day with 10 more outside the box ideas. Yeah. And often great ones on it. Yeah, no, you can do that all day. And I think that's the fun of it sometimes.
That's awesome.
The challenges of figuring out how to navigate.
Exactly. And I love, it's like asking that question, well, yes and yes, or tell me more, or give me, to make people think of different options of how to do it so that they have to let it go.
Absolutely.
All right. I have two questions to end. One, does this law, speaking specifically of Washington, does it matter that if it's an internal corporate event or if it's an external event, like a food festival, or it's not probably a food festival, but an association convention, does it pertain differently to in-house corporate has to handle it than an outside association?
So it does. And there are some sort of detailed nuance about when the law applies, how it applies. There's some, if you're very small, you don't do enough business in Washington, it applies to us. It applies to a lot of companies, but it's worth looking into sort of those that apply to your organization. But there are some carve-outs, including one sort of, I don't have the phrasing in front of me, but something along the lines of, it doesn't apply to employees when they're acting in the scope of their employment. So if you are having a team lunch, it wouldn't necessarily apply then. But then if people bring spouses, if they bring guests, and I think we're going to see a lot about how the law is implemented. Like I said, it goes into effect the earliest sort of in late March. So I think we'll see is something like an incentive trip, people acting in the scope of their employment. I would say yes, but I think we'll see more guidance on how the law gets rolled out as it gets okay. So you see people design around it.
Okay. Yeah. Cause I mean, going back to that statement that I said is like, well, if it's a $5,000 donor, are they going to give you the money? But same thing, if I'm selling widgets for you when I won this incentive trip, if you've taken my data or if you fed me something and you use that information, am I going to sell as many widgets for you next year? Right.
And that's where I think our default, and clients will make their own decisions, will probably be to default to rolling it out to everyone, because to make those decisions on an event by event basis, when we're hoping to design sort of a consent gathering process that feels organic and helpful.
Right.
It's having people have the best experience at an event. So we're hoping that if we do it right, you'd want it on everything and not have to say, well, we won't collect this for employees, because you need that information if you're doing a 20-person internal dinner, the same as you
right.
10,000-person conference.
Right. Yeah. Going back to the often and what the phrase was, early and often, is that your health information could change. Like tomorrow you get diagnosed with celiac disease, or you get hit by a car and you broke your foot. So making sure that there's also ways for people to share new information if something changes from the time that they registered. I think that's also very important.
That's a good point. And things can change even on site. Somebody can come on site and then not be feeling well, or will get injured, and having that sort of dynamic sort of, is this still what you want? Does this still make sense? Right. And the ability to go in and change that information or add to it in a way that, again, is not coming up to the registration desk and saying, I just got diagnosed with this illness, and now everybody's hearing about your coworkers. There's just things that you may or may not want people to know. Right. And I think that's a great suggestion, to have a mechanism for people to provide updated information. I think it's a great idea.
Well, and even and going back to like, let's destroy that data, right? Because things change, asking the information, well, you always know that Jill is celiac, right? But that might, or whatever it is, she doesn't have a shellfish allergy, but today she does. This year she did get diagnosed. And so making sure that you are re-asking the questions, because something else, you're celiac, but now you also know that you're allergic to shellfish, right? So we cannot just make the assumption year after year or event after event that information stays the same.
I think that's a great point. That can change. People get wrong diagnoses, overcome allergies. Things happen all the time. And there's a risk to storing that data. So we try to not hold on to that sort of extra sensitive data longer than we have to.
Right.
And then that's another place where the guest experience of asking every time is probably better, because you have more up-to-date information. You can also cut your risk by not holding on sort of tabs. People tend to be data pack rats and hold on to more than they need for longer. And is it relevant that if I went to an event 15 years ago, I had a nut allergy?
Right.
It probably doesn't matter now, because the world is so different. People are different. Change that old data creates a risk to you, but probably doesn't do much benefit.
Right. Exactly. Unless it's just that aggregate information going, and you're following it along the path of like, hey, 15 years ago, we only had 5 people, but now we have 25 people, right? With different.
And that data is relatively safe to say 10% of the people at this event had dietary restrictions in 2005, and now it's 15%.
Right.
That trend data, we get so much wealth from. But Jill had a peanut allergy and now she doesn't. Really not that interesting from a data and analytics.
Right.
And that's what our data team, we've worked together a lot to say, most of the gems we want to pull from our data aren't really person specific. They're trends, they're aggregated data. So they've managed to do a lot while sort of anonymizing and aggregating data.
Awesome. That's so cool. All right. Awesome. I love this. I'm so nerdy about all of this as well. Okay. So my final question for you is, and I ask this of everybody, but what does a safe, sustainable, and inclusive food and beverage experience look like to you or feel like to you?
So to me, I think transparency, we talked about this a lot, that people know what they're getting, both in terms of how their data is being shared, how it's being collected, but also people know what they're getting. They know how it's being used. They know why. I think that's helpful from sort of a actual safety standpoint, but also from a data security standpoint, that people sort of have disclosure and transparency and that they're consenting every step of the way. So I think that to me is really first and foremost sort of top of mind for us right now.
Okay, awesome. Well, Jill, I am going to post, if you want to get a hold of Jill, I have her LinkedIn profile here. But is there any other, we need to get that little A40 off your LinkedIn profile. I'll show you how to do that later. But that's how to get a hold of her on LinkedIn, but also just Merit's Global, is it merits.com, right?
Yeah, merits.com. You can reach out to us, to our team. We're going to be spending a lot of time thinking about this, probably putting out some more content around Washington's laws sort of as it gets closer. But yeah, reach out to me, reach out to our team. We're always happy to talk about these things.
Yeah, and I would love to come back and talk to you about it if, some more, if anything else comes up about it or from any other state that's different, that would be awesome.
Absolutely. I suspect this is the start of a trend. So good job security for me for the next 5 years. Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome, Jill. Thank you. Everybody stay safe. Until next time, stay safe and eat well. It's next Wednesday at 12 o'clock, and you'll see more about that later. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Eating at a Meeting podcast, where every meal matters. I'm Tracy Stuckrath, your food and beverage inclusion expert. Call me and let's get started right now on creating safe and inclusive food and beverage experiences for your customers, your employees, and your communities. Share the podcast with your friends and colleagues at our Eating at a Meeting Facebook page and on all podcast platforms. To learn more about me and receive valuable information, go to tracystuckrath.com. And if you'd like more information on how to feed engagement, nourish inclusion, and bolster your bottom line, then visit eatingatameeting.com.